So if you're a school social worker, a school psychologist, a school counselor, the role that you're playing at this point is to really be an in-between the kids and the teachers in a lot of ways. Because of the training, you have some background in some of the mental health stuff. It's hard to know to what degree some of the graduate programs are teaching a lot of the in-depth trauma stuff, but essentially the role is to figure out ways to be able to communicate this stuff to teachers. And my hope today is to help give you some of those ideas on how to do that. But one of the first things that I talk about is that trauma is relative to everyone. And so what happens in schools is, teachers they don't have this background. And so there'll be a traumatic experience for a kid. The kid will be coming from an impoverished environment, a lot of domestic violence, things of that nature. And the teacher let's say you have two kids in a class and both come from a domestic violent relationship or domestic violent home, and the parent and the teachers know this just from the basic conversations. One kid seems to have it all together and is able to get through their day pretty well, and the other kid completely unravels when they walk in the door. And teachers sometimes get frustrated about this because they're like, well, why can this kid, but this kid can't? And I always talk about that trauma is relative, and the experience I use is, and sometimes I'll talk about things in the training that might seem a little extreme, but that, again, is the degree of the kinds of kids I was working with. But I worked with a kid once who was beaten with tack strip, which is the stuff that's underneath carpets. It was attached to a board, and he was beaten with it. And he was 15, so he's a pretty verbal kid. He had a lot of anger problems. And, as the therapist at the time, I was working on that with him and doing some therapy with him on that, assuming that that was the most traumatic experience of his life. But in reality, at one point in time in the therapy session, he basically was like, hey, look, Mr. Aaron, I know you think that's the worst thing that ever happened to me, but to be honest, I don't think it is. He's like, I confronted my stepdad, I beat him up, which he actually did. He was a pretty tough kid. We got digging deeper into his trauma, and it turns out that what had really traumatized that kid, what had set everything in motion for him, was a flippant comment that his birth mother made at passing along the lines of, you're not going to amount to anything, you're worthless. And it was literally a 1.5 second conversation, and that had floored that kid and really set all of these things in motion for his behavior. So I say that story because I want people to realize it's not always, what is traumatic to one may not be traumatic to another. It's perceptive in nature, and it's important for teachers to sort of understand that on some level so that they don't always compare and contrast. Trauma is also not what you think. It's hard for me to know how much people get and how much they don't. But basically, the main component at which trauma is stored in the brain is what's called nondeclarative memory. It's not the thought in a child's head. So any story that a child could tell you in a therapy session, any conversation they can kind of disclose about what's going on at home, or they come into the class and they, have a few moments with the teacher and they're telling the teacher about something that happened that morning that was, difficult or scary or something like that. That story is not the dominant way that that's stored in the child's brain. The dominant way it's stored in the child's brain is what's called non-declarative memory, and it's similar to what's called procedural memory. And so what that means is like a procedure, like brushing your teeth or riding a bike. And so if you or teachers have ever heard anyone say, and a lot of us have heard some version of this at some point in our lives, so teachers can relate to this, people can relate to this, they're like, well, why don't you just get over it? You're effectively telling the child or the person, why don't you unlearn riding a bike? It doesn't work that way. There actually is a super cool video on YouTube called The Backwards Bicycle that you all can look up, that a guy actually did reverse engineer a bike and tried to learn how to do it, and it took him 8 months to unlearn it, which was pretty fascinating, pretty cool. So it's just important to realize that when we're working with kids in a trauma scenario, the healing really occurs over a period of time, and that I'll talk more about that later in the training. We are also built to heal. Humans are neurobiologically designed to be in relationships with other human beings. We read and respond to people. Our brains are organized and wired that way. The relationships create a context for us to heal. And that's the thing that is really important for teachers to know, for everyone in a school to know, is that, some of the other trainings I do really are talking about how school systems are becoming sort of the front lines of mental health now. And a lot of educators were never trained that way, and they're feeling overwhelmed because they're like, we're seeing all this stuff, we're having to deal with all this stuff, we don't know what to do. I think a good place to start is it's really the relationship. I'll talk a little more about that. There's some important pieces to know about that, but effectively, we're built to heal. All of us have a natural neurobiological mechanism built inside of us to heal, and we're built to heal in relationships. And so when kids come into your schools and they're coming from really difficult circumstances, or they've had some kind of huge loss in their life, the healing starts in the relationship. It really does. And that's not just the relationship with the teachers and social, it's relationships with their peers. It could be a relationship with a janitor, for goodness sake. It could be anybody, really. In our school, we had watchdog dads, and some of those dads were awesome mentors to a lot of kids in the school, because they would come really frequently and they would really give support to a lot of kids who needed it. So it starts in the relationship. I think a lot of people know this now, but basically unsafe environments definitely make it harder to heal. Schools know this. The kids will come to school, and for a lot of kids, the school is the safest part of their day. And it's frustrating for teachers and school personnel to really realize that they're trying their best to give education to a child and create a safe environment for that child to learn, knowing that they're literally sending the kid right back to an environment that's not safe. And I know that that's frustrating and it's really hard for teachers. But I reframe that and I just say, well, for a part of that child's day, you are creating the safe environment. And that's absolutely huge for resilience building. The basic studies on attachment say that if a child has at least one stable attachment figure in the first 3 years of life, and this is just an analogy, that the studies of resiliency go up dramatically. So that same comparison can be made for children who, the fourth grader who's coming to your class every day, and you're able to create that safe environment for them.